Welcome to our webinar. I'm sure many of you are a bit tired of so many webinars, so we decided this time to make a short webinar of half an hour and have no less an ambition than to say that we will provide you with twice the information in half the time. This webinar is about the launch of the Climate Transparency Report. I'm coordinating climate transparency, and I'm joined here by colleagues from around the world of climate transparency. There's Katrina Godina, who is from the Humboldt-Viadrina Governance Platform and the Secretariat of Climate Transparency. We have Cho-Jin Kim, who is from Solutions from Our Climate in Korea. And from Mexico, we have Mariana Gutierrez Grados, who is with the Iniciativa Climática de Mexico. And we are led through this session today by Deborah Ramalop, who is with Climate Analytics. Deborah.
Thank you, Gert, for that welcome note, and welcome to all our participants. As Gert has indicated, we have very tight timeline. So it's going to be short presentations from the three experts, basically presenting the report that was launched, that has been published today by Climate Transparency. Climate Transparency is the partnership of 14 organizations that together worked on coming up with this report, basically an independent review of G20 climate action. So the report also includes country profiles for all the G20 countries. It also covers the most recent developments and takes stock of G20 performance in the areas of climate adaptation, mitigation, and finance. The report also highlights key opportunities for G20 countries for enhanced climate action needed to achieve the Paris goals. So in a minute, we will be hearing from the three experts. Katrina, who will be presenting the key highlights of the report, and she will be followed by Cho-Jin and Marianne on how to close the ambition gap with main focus on South Korea and Mexico. At the end, we will have a short period to take your questions. We may not be able to take all your questions given the time constraints. However, just keep those questions coming. We will follow up via emails, and we will try to respond to all your questions later on after the webinar. And in the meantime, also please contribute to the debates on our Twitter using hashtag #CityReport2020. I think let's start with the presentation. Katrina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think all of us can agree that 2020 has been a hard and challenging year. It's definitely shown us our vulnerability to global risks and the importance of working together and addressing those risks. Responding to climate change will be one of the greatest challenges of our generation, and it's important that we don't lose sight of this even as we deal with the current COVID-19 crisis. Global temperatures are already 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Global warming is clearly linked to extreme climate and weather events, which have very concerning impacts for sustainability, for sustainable development, and for the security of our societies. In 2015, leaders from around the world came together to identify clear goals on how to respond to the threat of climate change. The Paris Agreement sets three clear goals, the first being to increase the ability to adapt to climate change and to support sustainable and resilient development. The second is to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to keep in line with our temperature goals. To meet a 1.5 degree temperature goal, we need to reduce emissions to net zero by the middle of this century. Last but not least, the finance goal is to make financial flows and our financial systems consistent with low GHG emissions development, which is necessary to achieve the other goals. So first, to begin with some good news from the Climate Transparency Report, emissions decreased in 2019 for the first time not related to an external economic crisis or another event. This is really showing that climate policies are working when it comes to decarbonization in the power sector and also energy efficiency. Not so good news is that emissions continued to decrease in 2020. This, of course, was the result of the COVID-19 crisis, which has had devastating impacts across our economies and societies. However, as we all do our best to recover and governments are rolling out large stimulus packages to support recovery, we need to try and make sure that emissions don't rebound and that we decouple recovery from climate disaster and emissions continuing to grow. Underlying the positive development in 2019 is real success and progress starting to happen and become visible in the power sector. In 2019, emissions decreased by 2.4% from the sector, and part of the story has been a decline in coal consumption of 2%, which has been driven by multiple policies and measures that governments are starting to implement, including setting clear coal phase-out dates, reducing or restricting coal finance, and also designing and implementing just transition policies. On the other side, renewables are continuing to grow in power. In 2019, they increased to 27% of power generation. And this is having an incredible impact, as we already see, on emissions intensity of the power sector, with many good implications for decarbonization in other sectors. In 2020, despite the COVID-19 crisis, renewables are again expected to increase, showing the resilience of the industry and also the impact of policies in the renewable space. However, while we see a very positive story happening in the power sector, overall fossil fuels still dominate. Too many countries are replacing oil and coal with oil and gas, raising deep concerns about being locked into an alternative fossil future that would still contribute to climate change. This is even as we know that renewable energies are clearly becoming feasible at very, very high percentages of the energy mix. And we also know that that is necessary if we want to meet climate goals. Compared to the power sector, when we look at transport, building, and industry, emissions from these sectors continued to grow in 2019, in some cases even higher than long-term trends or emissions in the previous years. While electrification in these sectors can definitely help, say, for example, electric vehicles in the transport sector, we need to also make sure that we're investing in innovation, in new technologies, and investing also in alternative fuels in these different sectors. Having looked at some of the highlights, we need to also now return to the COVID-19 recovery packages and responses in order to ask how and what countries can do now to make sure that recoveries are green and in line with climate commitments and resilient development. Overall, our analysis includes tools such as the Vivid Economics Greenness of Stimulus Indicator, the Energy Policy Tracker, as well as qualitative comparisons of different countries' recovery responses. When we look at the G20 as a group, we find that most countries are allocating their stimulus expenditure as well as other policy responses in regulations or other areas in a way that is climate negative and risks lock-in as well as emissions rebounding. There is, however, a clear difference when we look at different groups of countries, where we see developed countries often continuing to invest in sort of traditional industries, emissions-intensive industries, but also adding a green component, which in many cases gets a lot of focus, although we should remember that there are other aspects of recovery packages. By comparison, developing countries have often less resources and are not able to take risks or perceived risks when it comes to expenditure and recovery. However, when we then look to what sort of principles G20 countries can use to green their recovery packages, we see not all of them are related to the fiscal space for stimulus, but also include things such as introducing transparency requirements for bailouts, reinforcing or at the very least maintaining critical climate and environmental regulations, as well as investing in people, which is really what a lot of the recovery is about and a lot of what the climate transformation is about. This year has been quite exciting on some things when we look at what countries are starting to commit. There's definitely been a bit of a wake-up call when we think of our vulnerability and also to what type of leadership and statements and commitments need to be made to show that we are going to build back better, greener, more sustainable, and to increase the security and prosperity of our societies. And we see this in now 9 G20 members having set net zero mid-century targets between last year and this year. In order to continue deepening climate action, G20 countries will need to make sure that climate is mainstreamed through recovery packages. And the report provides some clear insights on how this can be done, as well as details on countries that are already doing so. In addition, all G20 countries need to update their NDCs in 2020. The Paris Agreement really stipulates that NDC updates are meant to represent the highest possible ambition and a fair share towards climate commitments. And the report again provides insights on what needs to be in the NDCs and what sort of targets need to be included, including setting out clear plans for implementation, targets for decarbonization and mitigation, as well as approaches to aligning financial flows and architecture with climate goals. Overall, the Climate Transparency Report is an excellent resource for G20 governments, as well as citizens who hold their governments to account when it comes to climate action. Thanks so much, Deborah.
Thank you, Katrina. As I've indicated earlier on, we only have 30 minutes, so we will definitely not be doing justice in terms of the content, the rich content that we have in the report. So I still want to encourage you to continue reading the report. All the details are in the summary report and the 20 G20 country profiles. Now moving over to Jujin on how to bridge the gap between long-term targets and short-term action in South Korea. Jujin, over to you.
Good evening. Good evening from South Korea. I believe this launch takes place at a very interesting time. Korea, Japan, and China all have made meaningful net zero announcements last month and the month before. I think these consecutive announcements reflect the dynamics in East Asia as well. Although the countries are not leaders when it comes to climate action, the three countries closely monitor and benchmark each other. Nevertheless, despite the positive signals, what actually happening on the ground is a bit different. The Korean Green New Deal is, I could say, one of the examples. Key figures here, $63 billion over a 5-year period, which only reduces 12 million tons. If you equate that, convert that to tons per dollars, it's about $5,500 per ton, which kind of indicates that climate was not the purpose in the Green New Deal that was announced by Korea last summer. At the same time, earlier this year, the Korean government also financed 2 large-scale coal power projects in Southeast Asia, one in Vietnam and one in Indonesia. And after around when the COVID outbreak took place, the Korean government also bailed out a company named Doosan Heavy Industries, which is Korea's lead coal power plant manufacturer. So what's actually happening on the ground and the long-term ambition are somewhat incoherent. Similarly, all Korea, Japan, and China all do not have coal phase-out dates, and they all heavily financially support not just coal, but also oil and gas as well. And these have to be immediately addressed as well. The good news is that, at least for Korea, the net zero announcement will guide policy discussions when it comes to short-term challenges. For example, enhancing its NDC or putting in coal phase-out dates. I believe in this process, bottom-up monitoring by the press, civil society, legislature, judiciary, and shareholders will be important, and the data set provided by Climate Transparency will significantly contribute to that. So that's what I have for today. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was short and sharp. Thank you, Jujin. So we have recently seen the rollback of policies in Mexico. And now I'm going to hand over to Marianne, who will be telling us how can Mexico catch up on the just energy transition in that country. Marianne, over to you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. This is Mariana Gutierrez Grados. Good morning from Mexico City. I am delighted to share with you some highlights of Mexico in Climate Transparency's report. This year in Mexico, due to COVID-19 pandemic, greenhouse gas emissions declined around 13%. However, these emissions are expected to rebound during the coming years, and this can be explained if we take a closer look into Mexico's energy mix. So as you can see, throughout the years, Mexico has maintained its support to large fossil fuel investments, mainly oil and gas over renewable energies. And as my colleague Katrina mentioned, primary energy supply in G20 continues to be dominated by fossil fuels with around 80%. But as you can see in this slide, around 90% of Mexico's primary energy supply comes from fossil fuels, while renewable energy represents only 4%. So why the energy transition needs to be just in Mexico? To illustrate this, 8 out of 10 people live in cities, and around 30,000 people die every year in Mexico as a result of lower quality, which is strongly linked to different combustion processes like electricity, transport, and industry sectors. And well, despite the government has committed to tackle poverty and reduce inequality, the stimulus package to face COVID-19 lacks climate change and social justice criteria. Instead, it focuses on continuing major infrastructure projects, such as the Maya train and the new airport, which lack of environmental and social impact assessments. However, there is still hope. As my colleague Eugene Kim mentioned, recent announcements from Korea, Japan, and China around net zero commitments, and also US President-elect Joe Biden's plan to tackle climate change opens a new geopolitical opportunity to reshape Mexico's energy policy and reorient investment in clean and renewable energy projects. Finally, the government of Mexico also has the opportunity to update its climate change commitments by the end of this year and align its nationally determined contribution to a 1.5 degree pathway. So for further details on how Mexico can strengthen its climate ambition and action, please review Mexico's country profile available at Climate Transparency's website. Now I hand over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Marianne. That gives us a bit of time then to get into a Q&A session. I just want to say to our participants, although we have limited time, if you are interested in a specific country, go directly into the country profiles. The details are there. It gives details on all these indicators, and it's about 100 indicators that we've assessed. We're looking at the performance of G20 countries. So there is that information in countries profiles over and above the summary report. We have a few questions here, and I'm going to start with the first one. I think it's addressed to you, Katrina. What role can civil society and subnational actors play in greening the recovery and advancing climate action?
Thanks so much, Deborah. While the Climate Transparency report definitely focuses on what governments can and should be doing, we see that a lot of the action that needs to actually be taken is at a subnational level. And in this regard, we're seeing cities and indeed citizens starting to take quite a lead. And there is definitely some hope that there's also this bottom-up pressure building for more ambitious climate action. We can see this when we look at cities who are already much further along than many of their countries when it comes to setting net zero emissions targets. We see this when we look at social movements really engaging people, engaging policymakers, and really insisting that people are at the forefront of the transition. And of course, critical policymakers and legislature members have an opportunity to look at the report and look at other key areas of action to make sure that the types of goals that we're seeing really are put into action. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a few questions for you, Jujin, but I will start with the first one. Can we expect the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean governments to make some kind of joint climate ambition announcement ahead of COP26?
Oh, very good question. Unfortunately, that is not the usual dynamics here in East Asia. I guess there's a little bit of historical context there. What I think would be more realistic is there can be some kind of joint announcement, but even if that happens, it should be very general and very low key. I would say very general and in terms of quality, lower than expected. It's usually here, as you can see in the joint net zero announcements. It's usually look at the Japanese, they're doing that, we've got to do this. It's look at the Chinese, they're doing that, of course we have to move. It's something like that. That's what more usually happens here.
Okay, I think I'll come back to you again, Jujin. There's a few other questions, but I think let's go to Marianne. Marianne, there's a question for you. How can Mexico strengthen and adopt ambitious targets and policies?
Thanks, Deborah. I think this is a really good question. As mentioned, by the end of this year, Mexico will submit its new climate change commitments. These commitments need to become 1.5 degree compatible and include concrete actions to reduce emissions effectively. This could be an extraordinary opportunity for Mexico to position itself as a regional leader in Latin America on how to raise climate ambition. To this aim, the Mexican government also needs to develop the policy instruments required to set the emissions reductions needed by 2050. This includes the development and implementation of sectoral decarbonization plans, as well as an economic recovery strategy framed under a climate justice approach. So as a closing remark to this question, I'll say that Mexico is increasing its dependence on fossil fuels. So we need a profound transformational change in Mexico's current energy policy. And in this context, local governments have the opportunity to lead climate ambition by carrying out local renewable energy auctioning rounds to face the regulatory obstacles from federal government. I think those would be some relevant steps for Mexico to increase ambition, Deborah.
Thank you. There is a huge interest in the Asian countries. So there's lots of questions for you, Jujin. The next one, do you expect more countries in Asia to follow China, Japan, Korea with the net zero announcements? Jujin, you are muted.
Thank you. Yeah, another very good question. Yes, that is something that we expect. It does provide a lot of, I would say, justification, authority, power to the climate voices inside each country, especially those in Southeast Asia. There is a very, very, I would say, extensive economic relationship between many countries in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia are all big trading partners of the 3 East Asian nations that I mentioned. So yes, definitely, this will provide a lot of, I would say, reference to these nations in moving their policies.
Thank you. Katrina, there's one that links directly to your presentation on COVID. It says, what does low carbon mean in respect of the green recovery packages?
I think low carbon can mean a number of different things when we look at the recovery packages. First prize is always really zero carbon technologies, such as renewable technologies, green hydrogen, and also investments that are not necessarily directly in the energy sector, but are also zero carbon opportunities for investments such as sustainable agriculture. I think that's our sort of baseline. From that, we can also then extend it slightly to include some alternative fuels that are not traditional fossil fuels, but also have some emissions, and really focusing on least carbon for the best outcome when it comes to jobs, economic recovery, and development.
Thank you, Marianne. There's one about the Mexican government. What is being done to convince the Mexican government that its energy policy is damaging its commitments? Links directly to your presentation earlier.
Sure. So I think that independent analysis, such as the Climate Transparency Report, contribute to strengthen transparency and accountability in Mexico. And in the case of ICM's work, we think that collaborating in partnerships is crucial to become relevant and increase impact. So by collaborating with different stakeholders, we seek to raise awareness on the importance of increasing ambition, which is really relevant, but also about moving forward in and showing relevant progress towards implementation.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Georgian, we have a few others. I guess we will follow up on others via email, but I think we can still take one, at least for you. How do the net zero announcements fit in with the reality where the 3 countries are still financially supporting new coal power plants in other countries as well?
Well, that's a very good question, and I just wanted to follow up on one point that Katrina mentioned after I respond to this one. That is, the net zero announcements were relatively easier for the East Asian nations because they're far away enough. It's easier to convince the incumbents when it comes to a coal phase out and enhancing an NDC because of the coal phase out. That means that you have to take away profits from somebody, and things get more complicated. And that's why, although the ambition seems to be there, things are not happening at the speed that you expect, is why that is happening. But at least in Korea, the 2050 net zero announcement does reveal a certain level of ambition and certain level of political development inside the country. It will take a little time for the government to kind of rearrange the incumbents. I would say another point I would like to mention that came up from Katrina, what Katrina mentioned at the beginning, is not to disregard the power of subnationals, even in the most centralized East Asian nations. The subnationals have been a very powerful voice, especially with our coal movement. We have a handful of Powering Past Coal Alliance nations lining up to a commitment to move away from coal, and that has provided a very strong voice with strong constituent support. I think that role is going to be important, especially, ironically, in the most centralized East Asia.
Yeah, I think, well, we only have 1 minute, but I would really like to get to your views, Georgine and Katrina. We've heard about the recent announcements, net zero announcements, China, Japan, South Korea. So there's a question that you can work with now. It says, after the US elections, do you see a new window of opportunity to the G20 countries to lead climate action? If yes, what needs to be done to fully unleash this 2021 opportunity?
Well, I guess we could ask the question in another way. I mean, did the Trump administration really change the trends of enhancing climate ambition, at least in Korea? Not that much. It's the more important thing is the bottom up, I think, ambition. However, I think diplomatic moves from something like the U.S. Biden administration will be a good way to take away, I mean, to address the very low-lying fruits. I mean, coal finance is something that practically doesn't exist. It will not exist anymore in Korea, but it's our government hasn't said anything explicitly about that. A little bit of effort from, for example, the U.S. will make it easy for our country to say no more coal finance.
Okay, thank you. Katrina, any reflections before we close?
I think I'll just agree again with Jujin on the the importance of bottom-up and top-down action and everything in between. And we all know how important information is to empower actors acting across all of those different levels. I'm perhaps maybe a little bit more hopeful about the Biden administration. I do think that when we look at international climate negotiations, things have slowed down considerably in recent years. And I think that the US, which we expect to rejoin the Paris Agreement, we can have some hope that forum, that very high level and important forum for making binding commitments, might be kickstarted again next year at the climate negotiations.
Okay, thank you for that. We've come to the end. We are 1 minute over time, and thanks to our participants for participating in this session. Please note that we will be hosting 2 other events focusing on finance and the power sector. The details are on the Climate Transparency website, so please feel free to register there and participate in those sessions. Thank you so much for your participation.